All right, so Professor Dale Allison is back with us for a second session, and thrilled to have him. He's a distinguished professor at Princeton Seminary. He's devoted his whole life to studying Jesus, Christian origins of all kinds. He's written books, many of them on Sermon on the Mount and Jesus studies up and down. And so without further ado, I'm turning it over to Professor Dale Allison, who's going to help us understand the Sermon on the Mount a lot better.
Well, thank you very much for the introduction. Although I don't know about understanding it better, I still am confused about many things, despite having paid a lot of attention to this and even written books on it over the years. So let me just briefly, very, very briefly recap or remind you of what we did last week. So I started out by emphasizing how difficult the Sermon on the Mount is, emphasizing that some people have looked at it and just said, this is so difficult that it's impossible and therefore impractical. And then I spent time looking at 4 different Christian attempts to figure out what this is really saying. And I looked very briefly at Leo Tolstoy, who represents what I call the absolutist point of view, which tries to take this as literally, I guess, as possible, as radically as possible. And Tolstoy ends up with a belief that a follower of Jesus can't be a police officer, can't participate in armies, can't be a member of the court, shouldn't own anything, perhaps shouldn't be married. Really, really, really radical stuff. Parts of Tolstoy's thinking have parallels with the Amish and the Mennonites and Francis of Assisi, but he represents this approach taken to the extreme, shall we say. The second approach I looked at was the so-called monastic approach, which is very popular in the Middle Ages in Roman Catholicism. And it divides the world into 2 and says that Jesus's imperatives apply differently to different people. So if you are a monk or a nun or ascetic, you don't have to own anything, and you don't have to be married, and you don't have to participate in the structures of government and society and so on. So this was a very interesting way of looking at the sermon and saying, well, it makes sense if you decide that Jesus was speaking to different people differently. I think, as I said last time, there is something important here to remember. Anyway, the third approach was that which you find with many Lutherans. They just grow up with it and can't understand anything else at all. I've talked to them. They just think that it is impossible. And the whole point is to show us that we can't do God's will. And when we try, we fail, and we're thrown back on God's grace. So we just become good Lutherans, and it's all about grace. Now, I think that there is grace in the Gospel of Matthew and grace with Jesus. And in fact, it's really interesting. Before the Sermon on the Mount, 5, 6, and 7, chapters 5, 6, and 7, I didn't say this last time, but right before them, Jesus heals a bunch of people, and they do nothing. People just bring their sick to him, and they do nothing. They just say, heal these people, have mercy. And he does so. And it's only after he heals a bunch of people and shows up as this gracious, compassionate person that he starts making demands. So there's something there to that. And then the fourth approach I looked at is the 2 kingdoms approach, which divides not people into 2 sorts, but life into 2 sorts, and says there's a public sphere and a private sphere, a secular sphere and a religious sphere. And that the Sermon on the Mount is not addressed to the government, it's not addressed to politicians, it's not addressed to Rome, it's not addressed to the Sanhedrin, it's addressed to the disciples and followers of Jesus, and it is about their personal religious ethic. It's not about how to run society. And I shared with you the story last week of my dear friend who was run over and killed by a drunk driver, and whose parents, on the one hand, forgave the man who did this and tried to help him, and on the other hand, testified in court against him and believed that he should be punished and go to jail. So that in their personal religious sphere, they forgave him and had compassion. But as citizens, they didn't think you should be able to kill people and get away with it. So those are the four ideas or approaches I looked at. So today I want to look at two more. And when I'm done with that, I'll just make 4 suggestions, comments, offer some reflections. So the 5th approach to the Sermon on the Mount is what I'll call the Christological Interpretation. And it's associated with Karl Barth and some of his followers. Now, I'm not a Barthian. One of the reputations that Princeton Seminary has is that we're a school where Barth is taken seriously. And I guess that's okay. But I've come to think about Barth as a novelist. And what I mean by that is that, you know, when I first read Lord of the Rings back in junior high school, I just fell in love with it. I just loved this thing, and I can't tell you how many times I've read it since. When I read Barth, I thought, oh, that's mildly interesting, and that's it. And then I went on to the next theologian. But there are other people who read Barth, and they have this almost like a conversion experience. They just think this is a fantastic world, and they enter what I think of as this novelistic world of Karl Barth, and they can spend their lives, their theological lives in this thing. Anyway, I'm not a big Barthian, but I think he was on to something here. So here's the point, the main point. Barth thought that the Sermon on the Mount was a self-portrait. Now, that's a really interesting idea. And when I first ran across this sentence, I just thought, that's ridiculous. And then as I thought about it, I quickly realized that's profound, and it's also true. So what Barth says is that Jesus fulfills his own commands. Now, for him, that means he's the only one who can fulfill his commands. But I take this a bit differently. And what I think is that Jesus embodies his own imperatives. That is, he's a moral exemplar. He's an illustrator of what he asks everybody to do. Now, the way to see this, and at this point, it's just completely obvious. It's absolutely and completely obvious. There are all these connections between the Sermon on the Mount and the rest of the book. It's a huge mistake just to read Matthew 5, 6, and 7 and to try to figure it out by itself. So let me tell you what I'm talking about here. Jesus says at one point, "Blessed are the meek," right? And of course, all you want to know, whoa, what the heck does that mean? What does it mean to be meek? Well, the word meek here, the Greek word, occurs 2 more times in the gospel. And what's really interesting about this is both times the word is applied to Jesus. He says, chapter 11, "I am meek and lowly of heart." And when he rides into Jerusalem on a donkey, Matthew says he's meek. So whatever else this means, Jesus is embodying it. And by the way, I think that's important because right after the second notice that Jesus is meek, he goes into the temple. He throws his little temper tantrum, the temple tantrum, and he gets upset, he gets angry, he throws over some things. Whatever meekness is, if Matthew is a coherent text, it's consistent with Jesus arguing with people and even getting upset and angry. But that's just one of dozens of connections. So, blessed are the merciful. Throughout this gospel, people come up to Jesus and they say, "Son of David, have mercy upon me." And he responds. Jesus says, "Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake." And guess what, folks? He's persecuted for righteousness' sake. People call him names. People oppose his cause. People conspire against him. Heck, people end up killing this guy. He's persecuted for righteousness' sake. One of the first readers of the Beatitudes saw what I'm talking about. So I'm going to quote one of my intellectual heroes. This is a man named Origen, writing in the early 3rd century, folks, way back when. He's just saying what I just said. All of the Beatitudes that Jesus speaks in the gospel, he justifies through his own example. Blessed are the meek is what he says of himself. Then learn of me, for I am meek. Blessed are the peacemakers. Who is a peacemaker like my Lord Jesus, who is our peace, who made enmity to cease and destroyed it in his flesh. Blessed are they who suffer persecution for righteousness' sake, and so on. He goes on and on, folks. He says, the Beatitudes are fulfilled in Jesus's own life. Jesus tells people to go into their closet and pray. And later on in the book, you find him off praying by himself. He says, don't store up treasure on the earth. He doesn't have a money purse with him. He has nowhere to lay his head. He's obviously given up his job and is not storing up treasure on the earth. He says, turn the other cheek. Literally. At the trial, people strike him on the cheek. And he doesn't say, put up your dukes and fight back. He says, if somebody takes your outer coat, give your inner one also. He's literally stripped. Later on in the book, people take his clothes. There are dozens of these correlations. What he asks other people to do, he does himself. It's obvious, it's clear. Bart is right. Okay? So Bart is right. This is really fascinating to run through and look at all these correlations. I'll make 2 or 3 observations here, and then I got to go on quickly. One is that throughout the gospel, when Jesus gets mad at people, what he accuses them of is hypocrisy. They say one thing and do another. Guess what? He's exactly the opposite of a hypocrite. Maybe a person of integrity, somebody who walks the walk, somebody who asks people to do things and then does them himself, right? That's who this guy is. He's the antithesis of the sin that he is very concerned about in this book, hypocrisy. So he says, and then he does. And then I think the second big thing here is that this makes him a moral exemplar. Now, this isn't big in the Reformed tradition, and Bart wouldn't have liked what I do with this here. But Jesus offers a new ethic, and he offers some radical ideas. And whenever you have a new religious view of the world, what you really need more than anything, more than words on paper, what you really need are models. That's why after the Reformation, when you have a new way of being Christian, all of a sudden the Protestants start writing a lot of biographies. So the Catholics had their lives of the saints. The Protestants, well, we've got these new ideas. How do we embody them? How do we live them? Well, we better start writing biographies so people can see what it means to live like a Protestant. I think that's what's going on in part in all 4 Gospels. Jesus is an exemplar. He's an example. In the Gospel of John, he washes the disciples' feet. And then what does he say? He says, I left an example for you. Paul says, imitate me, right? Because he imitates Christ. This is all over, in my judgment, 1st century Christian literature. It's all over 2nd century Christian literature. It's all over 3rd century Christian literature. It dies back a bit in the 4th century when the debates are about whether Jesus is God and how to conceive of him as God. And when you start having these debates, then his humanity sort of falls into the background. But before those debates, I think this is absolutely everywhere. And it's just in the Gospel of Matthew, whether us Protestants like it or not, whether we know what to do with it or not, it's simply there. So that's all I'm going to say. I'm not going to spend any more time on that, but there's something really profound there. And maybe the main point for you is that in your own reading, you never think about the Sermon on the Mount by itself. You never think chapters 5, 6, and 7, and that's it. You always ask, what does the larger context say? Okay, now here's the last approach to the Sermon on the Mount, I guess, that I want to talk about today. And I got to be real careful here because I have trouble refraining my enthusiasm. So the first approach is associated with Leo Tolstoy, and I like a lot of his fiction. I think he was an interesting character. But this last guy really is one of my heroes. His name is Albert Schweitzer. So I'd like to introduce Albert Schweitzer's approach to the Sermon on the Mount and Jesus's ethic, and I'll try to rein myself in. It's my judgment that, Roman Catholics, they have saints. They have official sainthood, and they actually have a process, a juridical process by which they decide somebody is a saint. Protestants don't do that, and we don't like that. But it occurs to me that if, let's say next week, if next week the liberal Protestant churches or the mainline Protestant churches were to get together and say, we need some saints, I guarantee you that on the very first ballot, Albert Schweitzer would pass. There'd probably be some discussion. Should it be Albert Schweitzer or Martin Luther King Jr.? That's probably what the debate would be. But whichever one was number one, he'd pass through easily. Albert Schweitzer, in my judgment, was one of the most interesting, fascinating human beings that ever lived. He was a Superman. He actually wasn't like you and me. He had some kind of different alien DNA. He was totally brilliant, totally brilliant. He had a PhD in theology. He had a PhD in medicine. He had a PhD in music. By the way, these are 19th century German PhDs. You really had to work to get them, right? You really had to work. He wrote all sorts of books on all sorts of topics, and they're all really great. I teach New Testament. We still read his 2 books on Paul. We still read his 2 books on Jesus. They are fantastic. They're utterly brilliant. This man had more energy, willpower, determination, conscience than any of us does. He went to Africa as a medical missionary. He was the doctor of this place, which was a very busy place. He was also the pharmacist. Did you know that? He was also the pharmacist. He was also out there doing construction. In his 70s, he's still building roads in the jungle, hauling rocks and cutting down trees. He's up every night. He's up every night writing by hand. He doesn't have a secretary, folks. He's out there in the jungle writing by hand to all the high school students around the world who say, "Hi, Albert, how are you? My name is Fred. I'd like to be like you when I grow up." He writes them all back. He writes his letters to Einstein and John F. Kennedy and all of those folks. And then he writes these letters to the high school students. And he's always complaining that his right hand cramps because he sits there for hours every night writing. He also spends an hour every day playing the organ. He's the most famous interpreter of Bach of his time. He's also mechanically great. He's fantastic. He goes around repairing the old hand-built organs. He hates modern organs. He hates them. He takes care of these old hand organs. Everywhere you look at this guy, he has more energy than anybody. He also has more conscience than you and me. So if you read your journals, I'll share. I'm going to try to rein myself in here. Anyway, in his he developed. Maybe some of you read a little book called Reverence for Life, and he actually becomes a vegetarian. And he doesn't think we should kill anything. He doesn't think we should kill anything. And in his journal, he wrestles with the question, should we kill mosquitoes? And he lives in a place where there is malaria, and mosquitoes carry malaria. and he wrestles with his conscience. And he finally decides it's okay to kill mosquitoes where he is in Africa because they carry malaria. But when he's in Germany and gets bitten by a mosquito, he won't slap it. Okay, now maybe this sounds weird to you. I'm just saying he takes everything seriously. He thinks about everything, and he's totally brilliant. Now, for our purposes here, the problem with Albert is that he is a heretic. He's a heretic. So he had some ideas that many people hated. Maybe some of you will hate. He still has a good reputation. I really do remember, I was 9 years old. I was in a Sunday school class in El Dorado, Kansas, in a very conservative Baptist Sunday school in ninth grade. My grandma was taking care of me that weekend. And I remember Sunday morning, September 5, 1963, this old Baptist lady, Sunday school teacher, held up the newspaper and she said, "Little kiddies, the great man just died. Albert Schweitzer just died. He followed Jesus into Africa. When you grow up, you should be like him." Now, if she had any idea what he really thought about things, she would have been mortified. But all she knew was that he was a Christian and he'd gone off to Africa and was famous and won the Nobel Peace Prize and all this stuff. I really do remember this. I don't know why. I was 9 years old. The French missionary organization that sponsored him actually begged him not to preach because they said, "Okay, we'll give you money, we'll support you, but you're a heretic. So we don't want you preaching to people because you might corrupt them." Anyway, so here's one of Albert's heresies. When he read the teaching of Jesus, he decided that when Jesus talked about the kingdom of God, he meant the whole shebang, the whole enchilada. When he said the kingdom of God was near, he meant the end was near. He meant the resurrection was near, the last judgment was near, the eternal state was near. That's what he meant. And so Albert said, I can figure out why Jesus is so radical. Because if the world is about to end, who cares about money? And who cares about the future? And who cares about politics? God is going to fix everything very soon. And that's why Jesus is so radical, why everything is so counterintuitive, and why you can't apply it to society. Jesus was a bit like some of these groups, and there have been these groups throughout history that thought that the end was near, and because they thought the end was near, they gave away all their belongings. They just went off and did religious things because there was no more point in participating in the world. Now, Schweitzer thought this. It got him into trouble. People thought he was a heretic. And of course, they would ask, how could you follow Jesus if you think he was wrong about something like this? Now, that's a very difficult and complicated question. Schweitzer really did think that he was following Jesus, that he was interpreting what Jesus had to say in his own life. 3 observations just briefly then about this approach. First of all, if you read 4 observations. First, if you read the Sermon on the Mount, there really is a lot of what theologians call eschatology. There is a lot of stuff about the last things. There really is, folks. The Sermon on the Mount is not ordinary ethics. So if you go through it, you'll see that Gehenna or hell is mentioned more than once. There are several references to the last judgment. There are references to reward in heaven, which clearly apply to the world to come. They're not about receiving reward in this life. The Beatitudes, Schweitzer noted and emphasized, have future tenses. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Albert asked, when are they going to inherit the earth? Well, from our point of view, no time soon, right? No time soon. And in the world that you and I know, the meek are never going to inherit it. It's going to be run by politicians and kings and queens and military people, isn't it? Sure, and it always will be. So Schweitzer said, this isn't about the ordinary course of history. It's about the end. You have reward in heaven if you're persecuted for righteousness' sake. When do you see God? Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. It's a future tense. They shall see God. It'll take place in the future. So he was right. You can go through the Sermon on the Mount, and eschatology, thinking about the last things, that truly is all over the place. So he's onto something there. Here's the second thing that I think he's onto, and I'm gonna read this. It's very short, and I'm going to try to explain to you what I think he means here. So he says, in reality, that which is eternal in the words of Jesus is due to the very fact that they are based on an eschatological worldview and contain the expression of a mind for which the contemporary world, with its historical and social circumstances, no longer had any existence. They are appropriate, therefore, to any world. For in every world they raise the person who dares to meet their challenge and does not turn and twist them into meaninglessness above his world and his time, making him inwardly free so that he is fitted to be in his own world and in his own time, a simple channel of the power of Jesus. What he's saying here is that Jesus in his imagination is going to the end. He's standing at the end of history. He's standing outside of history, and he's looking back. And because he does that, he is able to extricate himself from all the personal attachments and all the current political conflicts and so on, and able to see the things that matter outside of the normal everyday concerns. So let me illustrate this by talking about a weirdo very briefly from the 4th century, a man named Simeon Stylites. So Simeon Stylites was, maybe you've heard of him. This is one of those guys that went up on a pillar and he sat and stood there for years. Now, what's interesting about him is that he withdrew from the world. But you know what happened when he withdrew from the world and sat and then stood on his pillar? People came to him and he became a celebrity. He was actually one of the best known people in the 4th and 5th centuries, all right? One of the best known people out there. And one of the things people did is they came to him and they said, can you please solve our disputes? Can you act as a judge in this matter? Can you help us with this economic conflict? The thing is he had no family and he had no economic interests and he had no longer any social ties and he had no political ties. He stood outside of the world, and people recognized that because he stood outside of the world, he was an objective observer, and that and they thought that he could be wise and impartial. Schweitzer is saying something similar. He's saying that Jesus, in his imagination, exited the world and was able to look at it from a different perspective. We're always looking at it from the perspective of our self-interests and our family and our economic interests and all the rest of it. Jesus, for him, is able to somehow, through his eschatology, escape that and then be able to say things that nobody else can say. All right? So I think there's a great deal of wisdom in that. Now, a couple of quibbles here with this point of view. One is that if you read through the Sermon on the Mount, there's a lot of eschatology there, but guess what? There's a lot of stuff that isn't related to the end also. A lot of stuff that is independent of that. And so I don't think this is all that the Sermon on the Mount is about. And here's the other thing. The Sermon on the Mount doesn't give you an ethic that's created by a belief in a near end. Because believing that the end is near does not tell you what to do or how to behave. So I have a friend, maybe I shouldn't call him a friend, but he's not like me. I'm one of these religious people. I really believe in God and some other things. I really do. But he told me once that if he knew that the end were near, let's say that he only had a week left to live, or that the apocalypse was coming in a week, you know what he would do? He would do some very bad things that he thought he couldn't get away with if the world were going to go on for a long period of time. He would do some things he's always wanted to do, but did it because he was afraid he'd be caught and be punished. So that's what belief in the near end would do to him. Belief in the near end doesn't create your ethic. It doesn't generate your ethic. It's simply, it makes it more lively, if you will. So for example, if you go to the doctor and the doctor says, you've got 6 weeks to live, then maybe you'll take seriously some of the things you've always known you should take seriously, but haven't been taking that seriously, right? Yeah, that's why the rabbi said, repent a day before your death. The rabbi said, repent a day before your death. Well, of course, you don't know when you're going to die. So what does it mean? Yeah, repent a day before your death, because you might die tomorrow. So thinking that the end is near simply makes it more urgent or more real to you. Whereas if you think the world's just going to go on like it is forever, you can always put things off, right? So there's a lot here to think about. I like a lot that Schweitzer has to say here, but it's not the whole story. And so here's actually what I'd like to do. I've given you 6 different ways of thinking about this. None of them are the right way, and none of them are the wrong way. They all have things to teach us. I think we should look at them all, and we should ask, well, what does this have to tell us? So Leo Tolstoy, I don't buy this. I don't buy this absolutist approach, but I truly admire people who are dead serious about the Sermon on the Mount, and they recognize it's not common sense. It's not common sense. And they recognize it demands something extraordinary and different than what we have in the world around us. I admire that. And I worry that people like me are too complacent. I worry that we're too complacent. The second approach, the monastic approach, is really important to me because it's right. It's right in that these imperatives of Jesus have to apply to different people in different ways. A rich Christian is going to hear the Sermon on the Mount differently than a Christian who doesn't have much money or doesn't have any money. It's just inevitable. People in power are going to hear the Sermon on the Mount differently than people who have no power. People who are oppressed are going to hear it differently than people who are not oppressed. It's really important to keep this in mind, that these words are flexible and that they're large and that they're going to apply differently to different people in different situations. So I take that away from the second one. The Lutheran approach, yeah, grace is important. I don't mean to belittle it. And if we try to take the Sermon on the Mount seriously, we really will fail again and again. They're right about that. We have to be honest. The Two Kingdoms approach, I like it. I live in it much of the time. But I still think that Christians and theologians need to be able to stand outside of their current political structures and criticize them. The Two Kingdoms approach leaves you too complacent about evil political and social structures in the world, and we can't be content with that. The Bardian approach, yeah, that's great. I'm all for it. I want to understand the Sermon on the Mount in terms of the rest of the book, and I'm all for. I guess this makes me more Mennonite than Presbyterian. Sorry about that. I shouldn't say things like that, should I? But they have a strong tradition of trying to imitate Jesus, and I think there is a place for that. And then I think there's a place for the eschatological worldview, which, if you really think there's more to the world than this life, if you really think there's a world to come, if you really think that there's an afterlife, if you really think that there's eternity, that should matter. It should really make a difference to how you think, how you live, how you ponder things, how you interpret your own life and the world around you. So Schweitzer was on to something there. So that's my first point. All of these approaches have something to teach you and something to teach me. And here's the second thing I want to say, that in my judgment, the Sermon on the Mount is primarily a collection of images. And Christians often go wrong as trying to read it as a series of imperatives, moral injunctions. So what I like to do here is I like to say the Sermon on the Mount is more like a novel than it is a law code. So it's more like a work of fiction, a good, profound work of moral fiction than it is, say, the New Jersey Driver's Handbook. The New Jersey Driver's Handbook has rules, and you better follow them, and you better follow them literally. When the light turns red, this is what you do, and that's it. There's no room for imaginative application, is there, when it comes to the speed limit? Oh, by the way, parenthetically, this has nothing to do with anything. I just read a survey of Americans and what they pray about. 7% said that they have prayed for God to give them a parking spot. 7% have also said they have prayed to God when they are speeding that they not be caught speeding. 7%? What is wrong with us? Oh, well, sorry, that has nothing to do with anything. Just popped into my mind. So the Sermon on the Mount is not a law code. When you read it, you know what you come away with? You come away with a bunch of images. You come away with the image of a log sticking out of a guy's eye or head, right? A log coming out of a head. You see somebody offering a gift at an altar and remembering, uh-oh, I got some problem with somebody else. You see somebody plucking out an eye, cutting off a hand, cutting off a leg. You really do. You see somebody being struck on the cheek. You see wolves in sheep clothing. You see lilies. You see lilies in the field. You see birds flying around, right? You see the sun rising. You see the rain falling. It's a bunch of images, folks. It is not a bunch of rules. In fact, on my reading, there may be only one rule in the whole Sermon on the Mount. That's the thing on divorce, which for me sticks out as a bit strange and unlike the rest of this stuff. And it's because this appeals to your imagination that it's more like a novel. You know, if you read a novel that has a moral focus, when you come away, you come away thinking, wow, I should be like that character, or should do what those people were trying to do, or I should be more like that, or I should think about this cause or this problem. That's what great moral fiction does. It's not what the New Jersey Traffic Code does. You can't take it literally, folks. So Jesus says, if someone strikes you on the right cheek, turn the other. So if you're a literalist, well, what do I do if somebody strikes me on the left cheek? Huh? He doesn't say so. He doesn't tell you what to do. What if somebody strikes me in the solar plexus? Boom! It's me in the bread basket. What do I do? If I'm a literalist, I'm simply sunk, because this isn't a bunch of rules, and it's not case law. It's illustrations of general principles, folks. That's what this is. It's illustrations of Jesus's ethic. It's a call to imagination. It's not a law code which you can follow. Again, traffic codes don't require imagination. This requires imagination. You have to ask, well, how does that apply to me? How does that apply to me? When do I turn the other cheek? What does that mean in this context? Should I always do it? Does Jesus always turn the other cheek? Right? the questions are really difficult. What does the golden rule mean? You know, the golden rule is really weird, folks. I was driving down the road a few weeks ago, and I was over by Wegmans. I drove out of the Wegmans parking lot, and I saw a piece of metal in the street. And I immediately thought, well, you know, so I swerved around it, and I thought, oh, the golden rule. So I drove back in, I parked my car, I waited till the traffic was clear, I went out and picked the thing up and brought it home, threw it in the trash can. But more recently, I was driving along the highway, and there was a large piece of metal on the road, and I swerved and got around it, and I looked at the traffic, and I realized I can't pick that up without endangering my life. So I drove on, right? Maybe I should have stopped, backed up, and tried to get it off, because maybe somebody was hurt afterwards. Anyway, the point is that Matthew 7:12, it's the golden rule, really did pop into my head when I was driving by these two little objects in the road. And once I stopped and once I didn't. It was up to me to make that call, right? I think that's what this thing is doing all the time. It's a challenging moral ideal, it seems to me. You can't take it literally. You simply take these images in over a lifetime. You read the Sermon on the Mount, maybe a few times. You hear some sermons, maybe at a Sunday school class where some guy thinks he knows something about the Sermon on the Mount and talks about it. You hear these things again and again and again, and then they become part of you. And then it's up to you to figure out how the heck to apply this image, to apply this scene to real life. So I think this requires moral imagination. It plugs in your imagination and asks you to do work, not just the work of doing something, but the work of trying to figure out in this situation, what does that mean? What does the end of Matthew mean? I talked about this a little last week when I'm called up for military service. I actually don't think there's a simple answer to that. I think there are multiple answers depending on the context and depending on the person, depending upon who you are and so on. Okay, let me go on to my final 2 points, and then if there are any questions here, I'll entertain them. So the Sermon on the Mount is impossible. I agree. But I'd like to defend it. I think that there are two different sorts of impossible requests. So let's say Jesus had said to us, I want you all to grow 6 inches. Your response to that would be, not only is that silly, but we can't do it, right? We can't do it. Now, when Jesus says, love your neighbor as yourself, you can't do that. I think he's right to ask anyway. I think he's right to ask anyway, because I think that what he's doing is he's setting up the ideal, and there are certain contexts in which you want the ideal, which cannot be obtained, so it's always out in front of you. So I can't love my neighbor as myself, but you know what? I taught my kids to love their neighbor as themselves, their neighbors as themselves. And I want them to try. And I think that they could get better and better at it. I really do. And I think the Sermon on the Mount is sort of like a ladder, or it's like a road, or it's like a way. It's something you go down. You never get there. You never get to the end. You never achieve it. But it's something that always is out in front of you, and that's good. So you know what? I wasn't always practical with my children. I taught my children that they should be unselfish. Isn't that ridiculous? Come on, folks. That's Ridiculous. We're all selfish. We're all inevitably selfish. We can't be unselfish. What do I expect from them? I expect from them to try to be less selfish. And I actually hope that over the course of their lives, they can be less and less selfish. And I think that's how the Sermon on the Mount should function. It should give us these ridiculous things, such as love your neighbor as yourself, or be unselfish. We can't do this, folks. You can't do it. I can't do it. But that's the nature of this thing. If Jesus were practical, we could actually say, okay, I did that one. That's over with. That's not what he's doing here. It occurs to me, I also told my children, I recited the 10 Commandments when they were little, and then of course I'd have to interpret them. So, thou shalt not bear false witness. What false witness mean, Daddy? And I would say, well, you should always tell the truth. And then I'd leave it at that. You should always tell the truth. So what did I think? Did I think they would never tell a lie? No. I also am quite aware, because I'm a student of modern ethics, I know that sometimes, maybe, it's okay to lie, or that you should lie if it's a little matter and you want to spare somebody's feelings, sure. If you're in the military, maybe you want to lie because otherwise the enemy is going to kill all your soldiers. You can find situations, you can find lots of situations actually in which you don't tell the truth. But I gave my children the ideal anyway. I said, tell the truth. I didn't say, except for the following 50 occasions that I can think of right now. That's ridiculous. It would have ruined everything. You give them the ideals, and then they have to figure out when to apply them, when not to apply them. And because they're ideals, they're always going to be out there. For me, I always think of Paul in Philippians 4. It is Paul calls himself perfect there in Philippians 4. It's a really strange comment. I'm perfect, and then he says, "Not that I have obtained it, but I then push on. I move towards perfection." So for Paul, perfection is the movement towards. I think that's what the Sermon on the Mount has to be for us. It has to be this set of imaginative moral ideals, examples, illustrations that's always out there in front, towards which we move and which we have to struggle to figure out how to apply and interpret. Okay, I'll make one more comment here, folks, and then I'll shut up. It'll be about 12:05, and if there are any comments, I'll be happy to listen or try to respond to any questions. So, in addition to everything I've just said, one of the ways I've come to think about the Sermon on the Mount is this: I have a conscience. And you all lived life. Some people have more acute consciences than others. Sometimes you pay more attention to your conscience than at other times. My view is that what the Sermon on the Mount is trying to do is it's trying to become your conscience. It's trying to become your conscience. And I think it becomes your conscience over time. Again, as you read the Sermon on the Mount, as you hear your pastor preach on it, as you hear someone in Sunday school talk about it, as you might read a book or something on it at some point in time, it keeps coming back, it keeps coming back, and it keeps coming back. And the more often you're exposed to it, the more often you hear it, the more often you confront it, the better the chance it's actually going to be in here, so that when you're doing something, it's going to say, uh-oh, you better do this instead. Or you're not doing something, and it says, oh, maybe I should be doing that. This is a text. It's 3 chapters that are trying to become your conscience. They're trying to move from the page to the inside, so that they become a voice inside that speaks to you, even when you don't have the page in front of you. When you're driving your car outside of Wegmans, and some voice says, oh, you better do that. And you respond and you say, I'm in a hurry. But this voice says, I'm going to win this one. Go back and get that out of the road. That's a silly little illustration, but that's how this thing is supposed to function. It's supposed to be inside of you. It's supposed to become, in my judgment, your conscience. That's its goal, and that should be its function. Okay, I'm done going on and on and on. If there are any comments, be happy to hear them.
Okay, well, I'm going to switch to the portrait view, and you can physically raise your hand, you can raise your hand virtually, or you can unmute yourself and ask. I'm looking at the chat, and Wiley's giving us a little bit of history that Robert Hamill Lambert and his sister Isabella from Lawrenceville were missionaries in Gabon, and it's reported that their accounts attracted Albert Schweitzer to Lambarene, and he continued the mission.
Oh, really? Well, I didn't know that. There's a Lawrenceville connection there, huh?
Yeah, there is.
That's absolutely fascinating. I had no idea. Okay. That's nice to know. Actually, I taught at last year on sabbatical. I taught at a place called Chapman University, and amazingly enough, when I showed up, it turns out some rich donor had somehow collected a bunch of Schweitzer's letters and pictures and clothing and medical equipment, all this stuff. I ended up lecturing outside the Schweitzer Museum. Everything was in these glass cases, and I got to lecture on Schweitzer while he was sitting there, 20 feet away, his canteen and all the rest of it. It was really neat.
So Hoytson, do you want to elaborate on your message in the chat box?
Yeah, first of all, thank you so much for your rich sets of interpretations. It was extremely helpful to me. But also, I've heard sometimes that some of these rules or laws or messages from Jesus are sometimes a new or a reinterpretation of the Jewish law for Jewish to help them understand better about how to live life and not just follow Leviticus to the letter.
Yeah. Okay.
And for example, turning your cheek was maybe opposite of what more the common practice was at that time in terms of how to deal with things that were done unjustly towards you or your family.
Okay, so yeah, that's a good question. And you have to be real careful here because you don't want to generalize too much about ancient Jews because there's diversity among ancient Jews and diversity among rabbis. So if you work really hard, you can go through the Talmud and the Mishnah, and you can find parallels to most of what Jesus is saying. But you find this stuff scattered, and as a Christian, to my mind, it's Jesus's genius that he brings together this stuff in one place, which is scattered, and he does take radical positions. So there were some Jews who are opposed to divorce, not many. He sides with them. There are some Jews that talk about turning the other cheek, although they don't use exactly that term. But they're in the minority. The majority report is that you love your fellow Israelite and you don't love your enemies, right? Especially pagans and so on. So the way I actually view this is that all the questions that are implicit in the Sermon on the Mount are being asked by Jews. He's giving his own answer to these questions. His answers are sometimes novel, and when they're not novel, he's usually on the more radical side of things, okay? You can't find rabbis who say, God makes the sun shine on everybody, and God rains on everybody, and so that tells us how maybe we should act. You really do find that. You find one rabbinic text where some rabbi says, maybe we should cut off our hand and pull out our eyeball. So one rabbi, instead of talking about a camel going through the eye of a needle, talks about an elephant going through the eye of a needle. So Jesus is using a very rich moral tradition and discussion here, right? So you don't want to get the impression that it's just Jesus versus a literal interpretation of Leviticus. There's a very rich Jewish tradition here, and he's engaged in it. He's very creative, and he's doing his own thing. And most of the rabbis would have thought he was it was weird about some of this stuff, right? But we need to be careful about caricaturing his own context. Okay. Thanks.
Anyone else? Questions, comments? David, unmute yourself, please.
Yeah. Well, Dr. Allison, your comments toward the end there really spoke to me about how the Sermon on the Mount can offer us guidelines and goals. But I'm just wondering whether if a person does something wrong and is contrary to a goal, one of the goals in the sermon, I'm wondering whether people would enter into a lifetime of regret that they made a mistake and could not, and just simply can't get over their mistake. It's something that sticks with them for their entire life.
So, yeah, that certainly happens to people. And I've known some very guilty Methodists and some very guilty Baptists, far fewer guilty Presbyterians, who really have struggled much of their lives with things they did, for example, when they were young. But what I always tell people myself is that Jesus, in this same gospel, the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus says, if you deny me before others, I will deny you before the Father. If you deny me, I will deny you. And he offers no qualification. And he's clearly as serious as he can be. And what's neat from my point of view is that later on in this book, somebody does deny him before other people. That is, he breaks an explicit commandment where Jesus is dead serious, and where Jesus says, he says, if you do this, you're sunk, Buster. And Peter does it, and there is still forgiveness for him, right? Mm-hmm. So I like that, and I always remember that and think that applies applies across the board. Yeah, so we said something about divorce here. I am my wife's second husband, and she grew up a fundamental Baptist. I know firsthand the horrible struggles she went through to leave her husband and everything that went on. I even know a very guilty liberal Episcopalian who got divorced a few years ago and is having trouble living with the guilt of that. I don't know exactly, I'm not a psychologist. I don't know why in our Christian context that is such a hard thing for so many people. So somehow that's harder than other things, right? I'm no expert on that. All I know is that we actually have a tradition, folks, that God can forgive murderers. You know, pastors go to prisons and they talk to people, and they talk to some people who've done very bad things, and they're all about forgiveness and trying to give them a new start. I mean, our tradition recognizes you can even do that, right? You can even do, if you can do that, you can do anything, right? Certainly you can forgive the things so many people worry about when they shouldn't. By the way, I said that the one thing in the Sermon on the Mount that looks kind of like a rule is the statement about divorce. Maybe that's part of the problem here. I mean, it looks kind of like a rule, but as I said in the first session, it can't be a rule. It cannot be a rule. Paul actually qualifies it in 1 Corinthians 7, and it makes no sense to say that adultery gets you out, but mass murder doesn't. I mean, or beating the children doesn't. You can think of all sorts of things that are as bad or worse than adultery in my mind.
Anything else? I guess my only comment is I'm thinking that we have a lot to learn about the power of grace.
Well, that's one of the nice things about, for me anyway, the Christian life. It's continuing education, right? I've never graduated. I'm actually expecting to learn, to keep learning in the world to come myself. So God is infinite, so I'm never going to exhaust any of this stuff.
Well, thank you. This has been very rich, and we do have the recording, so I'm hoping that it will make it more accessible to people who couldn't join us today. Anyone else? Last chance. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks for your attention. Take care. Best.
Thank you. Take care.